The other side, former managing director at Bain Capital, Ed Conard. He makes his case for the company's brand of free market capitalism in his new book, which is called Unintended Consequences: Why Everything You've Been Told About the Economy is Wrong. Ed's given at least $1 to the super PAC that supports Mitt Romney. He joins us this morning. So nice to see you. Thanks for coming in to talk to us.
Thank you for having me.
You were born into a middle-class family in Detroit, Michigan. You went on to Harvard Business School and then started working at Bain Capital, left for a little bit to do investment banking, went back to Bain Capital. How much money would you say you're worth today? Is it like $100 million, $200 million? Give me like a rough number.
I don't know. My middle-class parents told me not to talk about money, so I can't answer that number.
Am I close? Somewhere around there?
I'll let you guys guess. I just can't go
Okay, I'll go with something around $100 million or so. You ran Bain & Company's New York office. You were a managing director,
yes.
And that now is the focus of the campaign. Obviously, we were showing clips of ads going sort of back and forth. Part of the argument is that people, in some way like you, private equity gajillionaires are out of touch with the regular folks that President Obama likes to put into his ads. Regular people who, as they say, did the work and weren't taken care of. And I guess the thing is, by extension, so is Mitt Romney. Do you think why is that not a fair argument? Because you say it's not true in your book.
Well, I think business leaders play a critical role in growing the economy and helping to create jobs and making the United States as successful as it's been relative to Europe and Japan. So the idea that they wouldn't make great leaders, I think, for our country is a little far-fetched.
But do you think they make good job creators? Because right now the focus of private equity, and I guess has always been making money, not necessarily creating jobs, right?
Well, I think that it's half true that companies and Bain Capital work for investors, but more importantly, they work for customers. And you can't be successful with investors if you aren't successful with customers. And what you're trying to do is make companies stronger. You're trying to grow them faster, and that creates employment. And we know that the United States have created a lot of employment relative to Japan and Europe.
You argue in your book that the super rich is very good for the middle class. How is that? So
I make an argument that the economy has changed significantly from the 1950s. So that was the era of big business, where we were capitalizing on the value of mass-produced material goods like cars. You need big companies to manufacture them, a worldwide oil industry. You got to pave 250 millions of miles of road. You got to put 250 million cars on the road. Today, 13 people can create Instagram and $2 billion of value in a year. It's a much more entrepreneurial economy today. The individual plays a much more important role than in the 1950s, when individuals really didn't matter that much. And risk-taking today and the payoffs for risk-taking matter a lot more than the 1950s, when just funding large-scale investments with risk-averse savings, a lot of debt, as opposed to equity, which is much more needed today and in short supply. It's just a very different economy. So when you apply economics, you got to apply it very differently today than you would in the 1950s.
There are some people who look at the system today and would say, as the rich get more and more rich, the middle class, as we well know, is disappearing. So we've seen sort of this tremendous increase in what your average, very super wealthy person is making, and yet the middle class is being constricted and shrinking. And
yeah, I think that's a common misperception. The distribution around the median income is very tight and hasn't changed that much over time. And if you really make a comparison to, say, Europe, what you'd find is that our risk takers, as represented by the payoff for the successful risk takers, which are the people that end up in the 1%, if you will, to use the slang, is much higher than it is in Europe and Japan. Our risk takers are producing way more innovation. Google, Facebook, Intel, Microsoft, Apple, I mean, the list goes on and on. They've contributed very little. And if you look at our middle class relative to Europe and Japan, I think at worst they're the same. And if you really dig into the numbers, I think you'll see that they're substantially better. For example, we created 40 million jobs since the 1980s, mid-1980s, on a base of 100 million employees. That's a 40% increase in employment. Europe and Japan combined are in the 15 to 20% range. We brought 20 million immigrants in, provided them jobs, we educated their children, we put tens of millions of people to work offshore. I think it's hard to make the argument that no other high-wage economy has done more for the middle class and working poor than the U.S. economy has.
And there are certainly people who have looked at sort of that income breakdown and talked about how the number of minorities and women, how their wages have increased. But if you look at sort of white men, those numbers are not. And so that kind of adds up when you average those numbers out. So they take some exception to your numbers in your book. But I guess my question would be this. You argue in the book that there's this sort of level playing field. And I think for many Americans, they feel like it's not level, that when you're talking about the super rich, it's not just about the risk-taking, that somehow the deck is stacked against them. And that deck could be stacked against them, for example, in the form of lobbyists. I pay, I take Lipitor 20 milligrams, which means I have very high cholesterol. And I pay a lot for my Lipitor. I'd pay much more than if I ran across the border and just bought Lipitor, partly because there is a lobby that ensures that is brought in by the pharmaceutical corporations that wants to make sure that the prices are kept at a certain